pragmatism when it comes to foreign policy. That said, we're not going to live in a world where we depend on China for critical rare earth minerals, for critical components in our supply chain. We're not going to live in a world in which China gets to dominate the Indo-Pacific and we're not allowed to have commercial ties in that region because they're holding countries hostage and they all become tributary states. The Japanese have no interest in being a tributary state, and they're close allies of ours. The South Koreans, the Philippines, Australia. None of these countries want to become tributary states. Vietnam, for that matter, are not interested in becoming sort of tributary states in a Chinese zone of influence. We are a Pacific nation. We intend to remain one and maintain our relationships there. So that is a red line for us. We're not going to abandon, our engagement as a Pacific power. And by the other token, we're not going to live in a world where the Chinese dominate things that are critical to our economy and be held hostage by them. That's just silly to do it. Some of that involves improving our domestic industrial capability. Some of that involves partnering with allied nations to secure our supply chains. And the third point I would make is we have to deal with this unfairness. Chinese companies can do virtually anything they want in the American economy for many, many years. We allowed them to do anything they wanted in America, but American companies can virtually do nothing inside of China. And if they do, it's because they want to steal your intellectual property and then put you out of business and replace you with a Chinese company. That's why the president's always talking about reciprocity. Whatever we are allowed to do there is what they should be allowed to do here. Whatever they charge us on tariffs is what we should be charging them. And that's what the president's bringing, not just to China, but to the world, is reciprocity and fairness.
You have access as a senator to high-level intelligence. You have more access now that you are Secretary of State. Does the intelligence leave no doubt that COVID-19 came from the lab in Wuhan, China?
Well, I wouldn't say that it leaves no doubt. I would say, and I've long believed this, and I've said this irrespective, just common sense tells you, that the chances that this was and I say an accident, we know that the Chinese spent years, in some cases with Western funding, taking viruses and re-engineering these viruses, trying to predict what if this virus carried over into humans, what would it look like? And they were probably doing it because they were trying to come up with a vaccine for it. Let's say somebody got infected, messing around with that in a lab. They went out into Wuhan, they gave it to 10 people, those 10 people spread it to the world. I think the evidence is compelling that that's exactly what happened here. And I put out a report as a senator that detailed all kinds of circumstantial evidence that proved that as well. So I think, in my view, based on everything I have seen, that the likeliest situation here was that the Chinese were messing around with the virus, somebody caught it in a lab, and they took this novel virus and spread it through China and then spread it to the world, and it was devastating. And there needs to be accountability for that.
I was just going to say, there really has been no accountability for the CCP.
The accountability begins by proving it. And it's hard to do, right? Because the Chinese are not necessarily going to open their books. Look, if that had happened in the United States, if that had happened in some other country in the world, that country would have probably been forthcoming and said, we had a problem, guys, we were messing around with this stuff, and look what happened. They would have shared that information, and we could have worked very quickly, much faster than we were able to figure out how to counteract it. And they didn't. Instead, what they did is clam up and refuse to share information with the world, and then this thing spread and just ravaged the global economy. Just think about how many people died, how many businesses went out, how much money we had to spend in this country just to keep Main Street open when we had the shutdowns, how divisive it became. Some of that could have been prevented if they had been forthcoming. But instead, like most authoritarian regimes, they clammed up and they held that information back. So I think we have to do two things. We have to, if we can prove that this is what happened, and I think the day will come when we might be able to prove it. We need to show that to the world. But we also have to make sure this never happens again. Because if they were doing that, we have to assume they're still doing that. And we have to assume that they're still doing that and that this could happen again. And it could be even more devastating than COVID, as hard as that is to believe. We can't let that happen. And I think, by the way, a lot of countries in the world suspect this too. They may have the guts to say it, they may not want to stand up to it, they may not want to have to take on the wrath of China because they don't have our standing and our stature. But I think a lot of countries in the world suspect that that's what happened here as well. But we're the United States, and if we can prove it, we need to. And at least put the evidence out there that this is what's indicated.
Will the U.S. defend Taiwan if China moves against the island?
Let me just say that I think our commitments to Taiwan have been clear, and they've been expressed through multiple administrations for multiple years. We are against any sort of compelled, forced change of status. That's been our policy. That remains our policy. We're not seeking to trigger a conflict. We don't want to see a conflict, but we have made very clear through years and years of our policies, the 6 assurances, the Taiwan Relations Act, that we are against any sort of change in status by force or by threat or by coercion, and that remains our policy. And that's generally how we've left it, and that's what's provided stability, and I hope it continues to provide stability. Whether the Chinese and President Xi shares that view, I think there's real doubts about it. But we are not going to walk away from, for example, supporting Taiwan being involved in international forums where their views and their interests are not represented by the mainland at this point. So we're going to keep all the commitments we've made, but the most important one is to make clear that we are against and oppose any sort of forced change in status.
Okay, I'd like to talk about Afghanistan. Based on the intelligence, have Al-Qaeda and ISIS found a safe haven in Afghanistan that mirrors the pre-9/11 landscape?
Well, I wouldn't say the pre-9/11 landscape. I think anytime you have governing spaces that are contested, that you don't have a government that has full control of every part of their territory, it creates the opportunity for these groups. The difference between today and 10 years ago is we don't have American elements on the ground to target and go after them. In some cases, the Taliban's been cooperative when they've been told ISIS or Al-Qaeda is operating in this part of your country, go after them. In other cases, not so much. So I would say that I wouldn't compare it to pre-9/11, but I would compare it, but it's certainly far more uncertain. And it's not just limited to Afghanistan. I mean, there's real concerns about Syria, where everyone's glad Assad is gone, but there's about 8,000 ISIS killers who are in a prison there. And if the destabilization there leads to them getting out, we got a big problem on our hands. So I think these groups are constantly looking for new places to migrate. We've seen that happen in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. We're concerned about that as well. These groups are constantly looking for ungoverned spaces where they can plot externally and even to destabilize the region.
I have a question about Qatar. American victims of terrorism have won judgments in the U.S. courts against Iran. Qatar is sitting on billions of dollars of Iranian assets. Will you ask Qatar to satisfy these judgments for American victims of terrorism?
The answer is yes, but in a very, it's a difficult situation, again, in describing foreign policy to people. On the one hand, the Qataris, there's a lot to be concerned about, but there's a lot to be concerned about how they've given Hamas and others operating space within their country. On the other hand, this ceasefire, which has allowed these hostages to be released, would not have been possible without their mediation. So it's a complex relation that we have with the Qataris, where in some cases they've been very productive in some of the things they've done. In other cases, not so much. And so it's one we're going to have to navigate very carefully. It's what makes foreign policy so difficult. Foreign policy is rarely a choice between the great and the bad. Sometimes it's between the bad and the worse. And I think in this particular case, it's a challenging relationship we have, but nonetheless an important one strategically that requires us to be pragmatic about how we approach it. But that doesn't mean we need to look away or celebrate the things they've been supportive of, but also we need to recognize the strategic importance they've played in allowing, for example, to serve as intermediaries with Hamas and allowing the ceasefire to happen and these hostages to go free. Were it not for the Qataris, that wouldn't have happened. So it's a complicating juggling act.
Will you raise the issue with them?
We've raised that issue. Previous administrations have as well. And that issue will continue to be raised at the same time as we want to work with them on getting all the hostages out, because they all should be out.
I want to ask a question about Havana syndrome, or AHIs, these debilitating neurological conditions. State Department personnel, intelligence community, military, even families. Have directed energy weapons been used against U.S. government personnel?
Oh, I do not believe in the conclusions that we've seen in the past, and I think evidence in time will prove me correct, that these things happened by accident, that these things were a result of mass hysteria or some pre-existing conditions. Now, in some cases, maybe. But I have no doubt in my mind that something caused people to be suffering from these things in different posts around the world, not just limited to Havana. There's a lot of work still going on. I think we're going to learn a lot more about it over the next few years as more work goes into it. But I've met some of these people. I've interacted with them for years. And I can't explain every case, but I think there are most definitely cases where there is no logical explanation other than the fact that some external mechanism caused them to suffer brain injuries that in many cases look like they were hit over the head with a baseball bat or assaulted somewhere. We can't ignore that. And in the meantime, what we have to ensure is that whether they were State Department personnel or working for some other agency, that those people are getting the treatment and the support that they need. And it's a top commitment of mine to make sure these are people we sent abroad to serve our country. They were harmed in the service of our country, and they deserve our ongoing support, not being accused of things like mass hysteria or, they're just...
It's government gaslighting.
Well, I think it's outrageous. And I don't know what the intent was behind that, but ultimately, this State Department is going to be transparent with them. Anything we know, they will know. And in the meantime, we are going to assume the worst, and we're going to treat them as if they were victims. No matter what, we're going to treat them as they were people that were harmed by serving our country overseas.
Okay. We just have a couple of minutes left here. President Trump has talked about expanding the U.S. footprint. In a hot mic moment, Canada's Prime Minister said that absorbing Canada is a real thing. Is it a real thing?
Look, you know how that came about. President's meeting with Trudeau, and Trudeau says, well, if you even out our trade relationship, then we will cease to exist as a country. At which point the president responded very logically, and that is, well, if you can't exist without cheating in trade, then you should become a state. That was his observation.
That's how it started.
It is how it started. And I think he's told the story publicly. And that's how all this began. Look, Canada's our friend. Canada's our neighbor. Canada's our partner. But it goes back to the point I made. For decades, the United States allowed uneven trade imbalances to develop. During the Cold War, you know why we did it? We did it because we felt like we want countries to be strong economically, even if it means they're cheating, because we don't want them to fall victim to some internal Marxist coup that overturns their government or what have you. Those days are gone. These are rich, developed economies. And ultimately, who can argue against the fact that whatever they charge us, we should charge them. Whatever they prohibit, if they don't allow American companies to do it, we should not allow their companies to do it here. American banks can't even operate in Canada. So there has to be reciprocity here. We can continue to work together on all kinds of things, but whether it's Canada, Mexico, China, anybody else, when it comes to economics and trade, there has to be reciprocity, there has to be fairness. And who would argue, how can anybody argue against that? The days where we just allow countries to take advantage of us, that has to end. That's not good for the global order. That leads to imbalances that create friction points. That's the case with Canada. It's the case with a lot of countries who are our allies and friends. But on trade, we have an imbalance and it has to be dealt with.
Will you open up the State Department briefing room to independent journalists?
Yes, we're here today. We're here talking.
I was going to say, Secretary Rubio, you could have given this interview to any reporter, any major corporate outlet, but you chose an independent journalist who posts on X.
Yeah, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but here's my observation. We have to go where the people are. And so we need to communicate with people. We need to be able to, this is their State Department. It's not my State Department. I'll be here for a number of years and then my job is done and I'll go back to being a private citizen. But this will always be their State Department. And we're making decisions every day and they deserve to hear from us. Where are people getting their news and information? That's where we need to be delivering our news and information. I still talk with them. I just went overseas. We had a bunch of people from different traditional outlets on our trip. And we're not going to exclude them. But we have to be able to communicate people where they're getting their news and information. What we can't allow to have happen is we can't allow our message to solely be provided through the filter of legacy traditional media outlets whose, sadly, I don't mean to hurt I'm not trying to be mean here, but their readership is down, their viewership is down, their ratings are down. We have to take our message where people are getting their news and information, and in these sort of long form interviews where you're getting serious questions and can provide answers to nuanced issues, not little sound bites that they run during the cable news hour, for news and entertainment purposes. So we'll engage everybody, but we'll most certainly see a greater emphasis on independent journalism because that's where people are getting their news and information.
Secretary Rubio, thank you very much for the opportunity today, and thank you for acknowledging and supporting independent journalism.
Thank you.
'Cause the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away.